Here we go. So, good morning, everyone. Delighted to welcome you back. Today is Thursday, April 17th, and we are here to learn Gemara, to study Talmud together. I'm Rabbi Jonathan Blake. I'm here at Westchester Reformed Temple with members of our extended community participating in this study. The subject of our conversation for this semester is a continuation of the study that we began this fall on the Jewish life cycle. So, taking up the Talmud's own approach to the milestone markers of the life from birth to death and everything in between. I know that you also had a chance over the winter, among a few shorter form study courses, to learn with Rabbi Platkow, who did a shiur, a lesson on Jewish approaches to death and dying. We may end up eventually encountering some of that same material, but I'm confident that for at least 4 or 5 sessions, we're going to be discussing this spring marriage and divorce. It's really a capacious subject in Jewish thought and in the literature of the rabbis, and in particular the halachic literature, the Babylonian Talmud. Um, Three full tractates are in one way or another directly concerned with norms around four full tractates, norms around marriage and divorce. Um, Principally, tractate Kiddushin, which we're going to look at today, which is sort of the starting point of all commentary and inquiry into the subject of marriage in the rabbinic mode, as well as Ketubot, the tractate whose name announces that it is about the marriage contract, a singular ketubah, plural ketubot. Tractate Yivamot, which is specifically about a biblical, now archaic norm that in English is translated to levirate marriage, which is the condition of when the husband in a marriage dies and the surviving brother of the dead man has an obligation to marry his brother's widow. We'll probably touch on levirate marriage, though possibly only obliquely, and I don't think it's going to come up today. Um, and then there's tractate Gittin, which comes from the Aramaic word get, which you may know is a writ of divorce. It's kind of the inverse or the opposite of a ketubah. So Kiddushin, Ketubot, Yivamot, Gittin, four individually long tractates of the Talmud. Collectively, a lot of ink is spilled on the subjects of marriage and divorce. So I'm confident that the preponderance of our spring semester will be spent on marriage and divorce. Fascinating subjects in Jewish thought, in Jewish law. So as I usually do at the beginning of a semester, a new semester of study, there's a little bit of a longer preamble that I have prepared for this morning before we dive right in. Though we will dive into selected texts, not from the Babylonian Talmud at first, but rather from the TaNaKh, from the Hebrew Bible, and we'll be able to do a little bit of a comparison between how the rabbis, that is to say, the teachers of the law, the framers of Jewish law, understand the institution of marriage in conversation with, or even more accurately, I would say, in contrast with the norms of family life, marriage. I'm using that word in quotation marks. You'll understand why in a few minutes. Divorce, I'm also using that word in quotation marks as they appear in the TaNaKh, in the Hebrew Bible. So I'd like to go back to the beginning and just talk about what we will come to understand as marriage, first through the lens of the Bible. And the most important thing that you should know going in is that the TaNaKh, and again, TaNaKh is the aggregate anthology of biblical writing. So it includes Torah. It's an acronym itself. TaNaKh stands for Torah, which means the first five books, the five books of Moses or the Pentateuch. I don't know why I'm holding up four fingers. There are five. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The prophets or the Nevi'im, that's the Nun of TaNaKh, which includes a lot of the books that are more quasi-historical in orientation, as well as the literary prophets, starting with the big three, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, followed by the minor prophets. And then there's the Nach portion, or the K portion, the Ketuvim, or the writings. And those include books that you know, like Psalms and Proverbs, and also scrolls that are read on festivals like the Song of Songs, or Ruth, or the Scroll of Esther, Ecclesiastes, and so on and so forth. In the whole of the Tanakh, there is no such thing as marriage. So that's the most important claim I'm going to make. Um, Even the couples and the families that they create or establish or enlarge are never married in a recognizably Jewish sense of what marriage means today. To substantiate this claim, I've brought some biblical texts for us to look at. And in order to encounter Torah, we need to remind ourselves that it really is a blessing to be together to learn during this Pesach season, and we will continue throughout the season known as Omer, the early grain season, in which sheaves of barley would have been brought up to the temple in ancient times, and the first fruits of one's yield would be presented as offerings on Shavuot, 7 weeks from now, give or take. So let us bless. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We are grateful to the Holy One for the opportunity to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. And so I've brought some Torah for us. So we're going to start really close to the beginning of Torah, Genesis chapter 2, and a story that is well familiar to us, that really establishes the relationship between the first couple in the Torah, of course, Adam or Adam and Chava or Eve. So it begins in chapter 2, verse 18. Vayomer Adonai Elohim. So God Adonai, which is interesting that this story, I think uniquely among biblical narratives, deploys two names for God side by side as a kind of compound construct. Adonai Elohim, these two words together, the Lord God or the eternal God, or here they translated God Yahweh, God Adonai, said, Lo tov heyot Adam ha'adam levado. It is not good for the human, ha'adam, meaning the mortal, the being that has just been created in this narrative in Genesis chapter 2, out of the clay, out of the dust of the ground, in a charming and striking bit of wordplay. God constructs the first person, Adam, out of Adamah, which means soil or earth. So we are earthbound in that we are made of earth stuff. Ha'adam, the mortal being, the earthman, the earthling would actually be a great translation if it weren't so uh, laden with connotations from sci-fi. But I actually think that the word ha'adam is the earthling. Livado, by himself. So not good. Lo tov, heyot adam levado. This earth man, earthling, should not be by himself. E'eselo, I will make for him ezer kenegdo. Very, very hard to translate this phrase. The rabbis themselves endeavored at great length to unpack how to translate ezer kenegdo. Ezer is clearly a helper, from the Hebrew root ayin zayin resh, which means to help. And kenegdo is a preposition. So it could mean, I think in King James, it's translated as I will make for him a helpmeet, which is not great. Ezer Kenegdo, there's no literal translation. Viable idiomatic translations might include a helper with him, alongside him, against him. It could also mean as a counterpart. It could mean one's equal. It could mean one's mirror image. So there's a lot that's plausible in this construct of ezer, which means to help, and kenegdo, this ambiguous preposition whose meaning changes depending on context. But however you render it, I like what they did here, a fitting counterpart. That's very nice. That's more of a kind of like an idiomatic translation than a literal one, but it captures a lot of what I think the sentiment is intended to be here. Um, Vayitzer Adonai Elohim min ha'adama. So God created out of the earth kol chayat hasadeh, all of the living creatures on the ground, all the terrestrial living creatures, ve'et kol of hashamayim, and all the birds of the skies. Vayave el ha'adam lirot min, ma yikra lo. And God brought them to the earthling, to the human, ha'adam, to see what he would name them. Ma yikra lo. V'chol asher yikra lo ha'adam, nefesh chaya hu shemo. And whatever the human called each living creature, that would be its name. Bob Dylan has a great song about this called God, A Man Gave Name to All the Animals. I'll see if I can come up with the lyrics for it, but there's a reference to this exact verse. Verse 20. Um, Vayikra Adam Shemot Lechol Behema. So God, the man said about naming, the human said about naming all of the cattle, ula of hashamayim, and the birds of the skies, ula chol chayat hasadeh, all of the terrestrial creatures, ule adam lo matza ezer kenegdo. But of all of the creatures, none was a suitable helpmeet for the person. None was a fitting counterpart. Um, I guess we have an AI client that's going to summarize our meeting for us when we're all done. Interesting. Okay. Vayapel Adonai Elohim tardema al Adam. This is my dad's favorite verse in the entire Torah. So the Lord God cast a deep sleep upon the human. Every anesthesiologist's favorite verse. The God as anesthesiologist, not just a regular schluff. This is like a controlled coma because surgery is going to happen next. Vayishan vayikach achat mitzalotav. So he slept, and God took one of his sides, not one of his ribs, by the way. Etzela does mean a rib, but a better translation is that the human was actually cleaved in half, which has led many interpreters of the Bible to conclude that the original human being was actually presented in the sex characteristics of both biological male and biological female. So the original human was both sexes, and God split the human being so as to create a male and a female, each one a counterpart to the other. That will spin your head around, and we could probably spend an entire semester just tracing biblical notions of gender identity, which don't always line up with what you think you know about what the Bible says. So a better translation, he took one of his sides. You can even see there's an asterisk there. Slaot, traditionally ribs, but even Safaria thinks that this is, or JPS, almost 20 years ago in this new translation, not so new anymore, 19 years old, said God took one of the sides of the human being, uh, and then Vayiskor Basar Tachtena, and closed up the flesh at that site. So God did surgery. Vayiven Adonai Elohim, and then I guess after Adam was in recovery with his now counterpart, Vayiven Adonai Elohim et hatzela asher lakach min Adam, and God fashioned that side into an Isha. Ish is a man, Isha is a woman. Vayviecha el Hadam, and brought her to the human. And what that means, like, was he like, here, I have something to show you. There's a possibility that there's a sexual connotation to this too, that they were conjugated in this moment. Vayomer ha'adam, and the human, the original earthling said, Zot ha'pa'am, finally, or this time, because remember what happened before this is there was the whole kind of like menagerie of animals that Adam was naming. And I hope it wasn't too much trial and error, but the human concluded none of them was a suitable ezer kenegdo, a suitable helpmeet, right? So God had to come up with a different approach. It's like, yeah, I'm not going to pair you up with a fox or a goat or a seal. Like you need something a little bit better. Um, Etzem me'atzamai, I love this verse. Uvasar mi besari, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Lizot yikarei isha, and that is why this one will be called woman. Ki me'ish luchazot, she was taken from a human. So she is also a human. She is an isha and he is an ish. Al Kain, and here are the concluding verses of the passage that I'm sharing with you. Al Kain, Ya'azav ish et aviv et imo, and therefore, this is why, in other words, we're going to tell you something about the way of the world. The course of nature is that a person, a man, leaves his father and mother. Ya'azov ish, sorry, I pronounced that wrong. Ya'azov, that's a kamatz katan underneath the Zion. Yeah, for you, Jane, my dedicated Hebrew file here. Ya'azov ish et aviv et imo. A person leaves his mother and father. V'davak bi'ishto. He cleaves to his wife. V'hayu levasar echad, and they become one flesh. Again, I mean, it's more sexual conjugation than emotional conjugation here, though they're saying this is also the nature of how families are built. And Vayushanehem arumim, and the two of them realized, oh my goodness, we're naked, ha'adam v'ishto velo yitboshashu, and they had no shame about this. And that's actually more of a lead in to the next story than it is a coda to this story. But it presents us with the image before we learn about the narrative of Adam and Eve. Now, again, we have here, in a way, the paradigmatic human couple and the paradigms that are established about human coupling. And nowhere in there do we have a word that denotes marriage, right? There's no ceremony. They are, as it were, made by God a single, I'm gonna suggest multisexual entity, an earthling that has characteristics of both sexes, is cleaved into two sides, one male, one female, and differentiated, but they still have like this gravitational pull to each other. So that the way of the world, the text is explaining, is that men and women conjugate and become one flesh. Okay, again, a lot is said in relatively few words here about how the Torah understands the nature of human coupling. But what I want to make clear is that there is no social institution that provides these norms. It is rather this brilliant literary mind narrating the story, generating this text, that provides us with a kind of how the leopard got its spots story of the origins of humanity and even more the origins of human coupling, which are very different from the same attempt to establish various norms about our existence in the world just one chapter previous in Genesis chapter 1. Most scholars have concluded that this is because the author of Genesis chapter 1 is not the same as the author of Genesis chapter 2. If you are a kind of a nerd for documentary hypothesis, that is to say, the now almost 2 century old, possibly more, German academic hypothesis that the Bible as we have it today is actually constructed out of four or more source documents, given names variously according to their original nomenclature by uh, different authors whose names are associated with the different way they referred to God. The documentary hypothesis proposes that Genesis chapter 1 is a priestly source, therefore designated with the letter P for the priest, written by somebody who was a Kohen or a Levite or had a priestly orientation to Israelite and Jewish practice and thought. Whereas Genesis chapter 2 and following are the work of the J author, who uses Yahweh to refer to God. J in German sounded like a Y. So Yahweh would have been spelled with a J. So the J author has a very different understanding of the origins of humanity and human coupling than the P author, whose most famous line on this subject is from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, where God decides to make humankind in the divine image, male and female, God created them, is the kind of line that we can map into this conversation. But the deeper you go into those two verses and their surrounding context, the more you realize this is a very different way of thinking about the origins of humanity and of the two sexes and of their role in the earth. Whoever wrote Genesis 1 had a very different, what I call an authorial agenda, right? As an author, as a narrator of a seminal text, had a very different agenda than whoever was responsible for Genesis chapter 2 and 3 and 4 and what have you. Okay. I'm going to continue my preamble here by sharing just a couple of other norms, all from the same book of the Torah, from Genesis, but then you need to take it as an article of faith that what I said at the outset is true, that nowhere in the Tanakh do we have marriage the way the rabbis would institute it as a social construct, as a social norm or institution for Jewish life henceforth. And I'll go even further now and propose that what I believe the rabbis do in the Mishnah and, of course, in the Talmud, which is just the elaboration of the Mishnah, is to create, almost out of whole cloth, a new norm for Jewish family life that now will supersede the norms established in the Torah. This is not uncommon in rabbinic thought and practice. The rabbis, while rarely wanting to take credit for it, were not just interpreters of Torah, they were innovators on top of Torah. And as they saw fit, where the Torah may be deficient, at least for the time and milieu in which the rabbis were living and writing and working, they make changes. They make changes to Jewish life that are institutionalized so that it is true that today, you and I and all of us, whatever denomination we affiliate with, we're all rabbinic Jews. The way we practice Judaism is fundamentally the way the rabbis established and provided and elaborated. We are not biblical Jews. And my proof text for this has, I could talk about your own marriages if you were married in the Jewish tradition and your own weddings and the customs that were or were not observed. But I promise you they were rabbinic and not biblical. And you'll see why. But go back, you need not go back to your own marriage vows if you ever took marriage vows. You need go back only to last Saturday and Sunday night if you observed a Seder, which is an entirely rabbinic construct. I'm going to just go out on a limb and assume that nobody went into your backyard or your neighbor's backyard and slaughtered a lamb, which is what the Bible provides as the way to observe Pesach, right? So you didn't do that. You did a Seder, which is what the rabbis suggested, and actually no lamb slaughtering permitted at a Seder. And there are reasons for that that have to do with the temple not standing and all the other mishigas that the rabbis are concerned with. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is a second biblical text, probably also familiar. This from chapter 24. And this is the origin of, or this is the story of Isaac getting a wife. And I just want you to see how this unfolds in the biblical narrative. So Isaac gets a wife. So here's what we know. V'Avraham Zaken. So it begins by saying, now Abraham was old, ba bayamim. Literally, he had come up in days. Figuratively, he was advanced in years. Vadonai berachet Avraham bakol. And Adonai had blessed Abraham in all things. Vayomer Avraham el avdo zkan beto. And Abraham charged the senior servant of his house. I like that. El avdo, literally his servant, zkan beto, the eldermost of his household. Hamoshel bechol asher lo, who had supervision or authority over all things belonging to Abraham. So this was really his head uh, servant. And we do learn from previous chapters to this that Abraham had really done very well for himself, that his prosperity meant that he had tracts of land and a big retinue of servants and cattle and what have you. So Abraham was a VIP, a macher. Simna yadcha tachat yirechi, take an oath by placing your hand underneath my thigh. Several scholars believe that that's a euphemism for actually put your hand on the family jewels, swear by my genitalia. And what's the oath? The ashbiacha badonai Elohei hashamayim, and make an oath on Adonai, the God of the heavens, ve'Elohei haaretz, also the God of the earth, asher lo tikach isha livni mi benot hakanaani, that you will not take a woman, a wife, isha, the same word we got in Genesis chapter 2, livni, for my son, from among the daughters of the Canaanites. I want a nice, we would say a nice Jewish girl. Of course, that terminology did not exist. But Abraham is saying Isaac needs to marry someone from the old country, someone from the family tribe, not a local girl, a local Canaanite. Because Abraham, remember, is a resident stranger in Canaan, having come from Ur Kasdim, which is in the Persian Gulf, like way down in the southernmost part of what is today Iraq, all the way through what is today Syria, through the Levant, settling in Hebron. And this is 2 chapters after the Akedah, after the binding of Isaac. So Isaac's still in his life, and Sarah has died. And Abraham is very worried that Isaac might conjugate with a local girl. He said, no, that's not going to work. But notice that it says we say not take a wife, but even that is a biased translation. Literally, it says, do not take a woman from among the daughters of the Canaanites, asher anochi yoshev bekirbo, among whom I am presently residing. So this is, first of all, an arranged, I want to say marriage, but I'm not going to say marriage. The only verb that we get here is the very telling verb tikach, which means to take. And by the way, this is the biblical word that is used instead of the later words for marriage. So they don't have a term that means marriage. They have taking. And taking usually implies sexual congress. Because in this case, at least, the taking denotes that women were not independent beings with the same agency and privileges that men had. They were in the category of chattel, of movable property. We'll say more about this when we get to Talmud today, which I promise we'll get to. But rather, ki el artzi ve'el moladati, go back to my land and my birthplace, TaNaKh, go. Ve'lakachta isha livni liyitzchak, and take a woman for my son Isaac. Also, much could be made and has been made over, does he not trust Isaac, now a grown man and then some, to get his own wife? Evidently not. Isaac is very different from Abraham himself, who was something of a trailblazer, and certainly very different from Isaac's own son, Yaakov, Jacob, who never responds to authority well and who goes his own way in all things. But Isaac seems to be very much a dependent, even in adulthood. Okay. As if to underscore his point, Vayomer elav Avraham, and Abraham said to him, Hishamer lacha, guard well, guard yourself well, pen tashivet b'ni shama, against taking my son back there. So you are not taking Isaac back to Canaan. Isaac stays here with me. You go and find the suitable bride. And then it goes on from there. And there's a long story about how he eventually comes to find Rebecca. So it involves camels, and he has kind of a litmus test for determining that Rebecca is the right one, namely because she's overwhelmingly compassionate and serving of others. So she waters the camels, and I don't know about you, but I am told that watering a flock of camels that's been on the road for a few weeks is not like a 10-minute fill up at the Exxon station. This is this is all day. To water a flock of camels, you're going to be there with very heavy jugs of water. So we should not underestimate Rebecca's act of service here. Okay, so he finally schleps her all the way back. This is all about the finding of Rebecca. There's gold, there's silver. She's going with him. I'm looking for where. Here we go. And Isaac went out walking in the field toward evening. Looking up, he saw camels approaching. Raising her eyes, Rebekah saw Isaac. She alighted from the camel and said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field toward us?" And the servant said, "That is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. The servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Isaac then brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he took Rebekah as his wife. Vatehilo leisha. It doesn't even use the word took. It just said she became his wife in the tent. Less is said than more here, but you get the idea. And he loved her, and Isaac found comfort after the death of his mother, after his mother. Okay. And then immediately Abraham, who's, 120 years old at this point, decides that it's time for another marriage. Another story entirely. Okay. We're going to look at one more, and then we'll talk about these texts, and then we'll get into our Talmud study. So hold your thoughts and your discussion for just a few moments longer as I now bring up Genesis chapter 29. So now we're a generation further down the road, and we're talking about Yaakov. Vayisa Yaakov raglav, Jacob literally picked up his feet, vayelech arza v'nei kedem, and he came to the eastern land, the land of the Easterners. There before his eyes was a well in the open. 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it, for the flocks were watered from that well. The stone on the mouth of the well was large. This is the second time in a row that a critical meeting between two people who will end up together happens at a well. So the local watering hole then as now is where important romances are established, though I don't know how romantic this is. This is a pretty romantic passage, actually. When all the flocks were gathered there, the stone would be rolled from the mouth of the well, and the sheep watered, and then the stone would be put back in its place on the mouth of the well. And Jacob said to them, "My friends," speaking to the shepherds, "where are you from?" And they said, "We are from Haran," which is in the old country. It's in modern-day Syria. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" And they said, "As a matter of fact, we do." He continued, "Is he well? Is he doing okay?" Literally in Hebrew, Vayomer lahem hashalom lo. How's his shalom? How's his well-being? They said, "Yeah, he's great." And they say, Vayomru shalom. I love this line here. It's a great biblical text. They asked after his shalom, and they answered shalom. Is he well? He's well. Vine Rachel bito ba'im hatzon. And by the way, that's his daughter Rachel coming with the flock. He said, "It is still broad daylight, too early to round up the animals, water the flock, and take them to pasture." And they said, "We cannot until all the flocks are rounded up, and then the stone is rolled off the mouth of the well, and we water the sheep." While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's flock, for she was its shepherd. She is a shepherdess. And when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of his uncle Laban, and the flock of his uncle Laban, Jacob went up, and you're supposed to I think, read that this is a superhuman feat of strength, rolled the stone off the mouth of the well, watered the flock of his uncle Laban. So he's showing off his big muscles for this woman he wants to impress by rolling the stone off. Then he leans in for a kiss and breaks into tears. I have described this to my teenage students who've read this passage with me as potentially the worst first date of all time. Here's this guy, he shows off how strong he is. He kisses without asking, and then he bursts into tears. Like, if I were Rachel, I would have walked. But okay, that's not how it goes. And we know that out of such things, romances are made, and then Jacob needs to entreat her father for her hand in marriage. But again, marriage is never discussed. The rest of the story is that Laban verbally consents to giving Rachel to Jacob. But then on the night of the, again, wedding, but there's no wedding ceremony described, he puts Leah veiled in the tent, and that is the sister with whom Jacob wakes up the next morning. And they are conjugated. There's no way out of it at this point. It's not like the story unfolds and he says, "Oops, I slept with the wrong girl." It's like, "No, no, no. You took her." You so all of the language of what we have understood to be marriage in the Hebrew Bible is actually giving and taking, usually at the discretion of the proximate male with authority over the woman, either her father or the husband. So there's an exchange of property, which is why the language speaks very much in the same nomenclature as the Bible does when it talks about exchange of property. There is no consensual betrothal or marriage between the husband and wife. It's implied. And there is no such thing, as I tell my teenage students as well, as like there's no such thing as living in sin in the Bible. If you have sexual relations with another person, it is imputed to you by the Bible and actually by rabbinic law as if you are married, right? That it establishes the marriage as opposed to something you do before marriage. But now, obviously, we're not living in biblical times, so we've needed, particularly in the Reform movement, I think, to establish new, different Jewish norms around marriage and sex. But for the intent and purpose of our study today, of reading the Torah critically and understanding what the Torah is saying and also critically what it is not saying, it is not a fair claim to say that the Torah institutes marriage the way we as modern Jews understand the term. Okay, that's a very long preamble, about 40 minutes worth. And I am intrigued just to hear if you have any thoughts, reactions, or questions before we go into the rabbinic literature itself.
A question.
Please. Yep, Judy.
I I have a question because I think I took some courses at NYU with
Oh, Judy froze. Judy froze. Oh no. Okay, Judy, if you can hear us, you're frozen. And unfortunately, we got that you took some courses at NYU, but we didn't get anything else. Mara.
So I'm confused as to where the transition happened from Genesis as to a couple just coupling and a legal contract that binds two people legally.
Excellent. That's what we're here to learn. And this will unfold over, I believe, several weeks of study, because it really is a monumental transformation in Jewish life. Uh, Peter, my friend from Great Britain, hello. Unmute yourself before you speak, though, please.
Okay, thank you. There might not have been formal marriage, but there was eventually a bill of divorcement described somewhere in the Bible. So that became a formal part of the matter, did it, at some point?
I would need a I would need a citation on that in order to stand with you in that claim, because I am not aware of a writ or bill of divorcement being offered as an Israelite norm. It's well attested to in the Talmudic literature. And full disclosure, I've only prepared about 3 lessons out for this spring, so I'm preparing my lessons on a rolling basis. As much as I would have loved to have prepared all 6 or 7 lessons over the winter, other things got in the way. So, Peter, we're going to have to circle back to that, but I promise it will be part of our long form study this spring. As we trace the origins of marriage, so too we will trace the origins of divorce. But I actually think that the lack of a divorce institution in the Bible is a prime motivator of the rabbinic transformation of this coupling, as Mara, I think, helpfully described it, to a socially reinforced institution. Okay, Judy, we got you back, so I'm going to take your hand again, please. We got to the part where you were taking courses at NYU.
The things that I found so fascinating. Was there a Lilith? An awful lot of work on Lilith and whether or not she actually was the first person he took a marriage.
Yeah,
And he didn't get
there's a rich midrashic tradition, midrash being the rabbinic art of, as it were, reading between the lines of Torah and creating new narratives, either by way of explanation or explication of the biblical text, but I would argue just as much as a way of showcasing rabbinic imagination about the text and establishing new Jewish traditions and norms for Jewish life through the genius of the rabbis, using the biblical text as a jumping off point, but certainly not a limiting condition on how far and how imaginative rabbinic thought and text can be. There is a storied midrashic tradition about a first woman who was given to Adam before Eve came about, named Lilith. As you saw, nowhere in the Torah. Right? It's strictly midrashic. And Lilith, unlike Eve, is much less compliant. And let's leave it at that. Lilith has a mind and an agency of her own, and therefore is often a favorite subject of feminist Jewish critique. So much so that the preeminent journal of feminist Jewish thought is called Lilith.
yeah.
Yep. So you're right. The rabbis, and I'm sure it was a great course at NYU, but Lilith will figure nowhere in our Gemara study. And by the time of the Talmud, if Lilith is a known tradition, and I'm going to assume that she was by the time the Talmud is written, certainly redacted, Lilith is on the cutting room floor. So Lilith is a taboo subject to mainstream rabbinic Judaism, which is again why recovering Lilith has been a fascinating project of Jewish feminism. Thank you, Judy. Mom and Dad.
Since our ancestors didn't practice what we would call monogamy, because there wasn't the concept of marriage, but they certainly had more than, at least the men had multiple sexual partners, whether concubines or other wives or whatever.
Indeed.
How'd they figure out who was married to who? Married in quotes, but who's the wife here? If
Very
you're
hard to
taking
tell.
somebody to bed and that makes her your wife, I mean, how
Yeah,
do you
the,
tell?
the Torah makes it very clear that I guess you can read into certain passages, particularly Jacob and his wives slash concubines. Jacob has two wives who are biological full sisters, Leah and Rachel. He also has two concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah. But in terms of how these concubines function, they are fully the mothers of their children, and they are clearly part of the household. It is only in the nomenclature that a difference is designated, that they are called concubines and the wives are called wives. Other than that, it is not clear to me how different the status actually was. Same is true for Hagar. Again, often the concubine in the biblical stories of Genesis, where they come up frequently, is treated with disdain, which may be reflective of an actual social status assigned to or held by the concubine in biblical life, as opposed to a person who was a wife. But if what you intend to do with your question is to point out the what's missing from the text, which is that it is not, you're correct. It is not as if the Torah said there was a wedding between Jacob and either of his wives, contra the concubines. They all come into relationship with Jacob through sexual congress. Full stop. So other than the Torah telling us that two of them are wives and two are concubines, the fairest thing that can be said is that they both had a status that was closer to similar or even equal than different. except emotionally again, concubines seem to be subjected to much mistreatment from which wives are protected. But it's not clear if that was just a kind of a social norm that doesn't have any institutional grounding, and maybe one of the many things that the rabbis were trying to address in instituting new norms for Jewish marriage, which is what we're really going to jump to talk about. So let's do that. Thank you. Okay, so I have in my other hand the Koren Talmud Bavli, and this is tractate Kiddushin. And just to read a note here, I'll do so in the context of the Talmudic passage on which it comments. So what we're going to do for the remainder of our time today is look at Kiddushin, which is a tractate of the Talmud, chapter 2, page A, which, by the way folios were bound when the Talmud was actually assembled, 2A is always the first page of any Talmud. So you start on page 2. Page 2 is page 1. It has to do with the way these documents were sewn and bound together. Okay. So we're going to look at Kiddushin 2A, which is really the opening source on marriage in the rabbinic tradition. Now, again, I'm tempted to dive into the text, but I'm also tempted not to, because I want to dwell for a moment on the title of the tractate. The tractate that begins the Jewish conversation, or I should say the rabbinic conversation about marriage, is called Kiddushin. And that's a word that should be familiar. So what does Kiddushin, which is an Aramaic conjugate of a word you know, mean? Kiddushin, from Kiddush, Kaddish, Kadosh, Kiddusha. It's the same root. So what does Kiddushin mean? I hear Jane mouthing it, but your mic is off. So your mic is on. So your mic is off. So turn it on. You can't. Okay. Yeah, it's the foot of your screen, lower left. But Jane knows it. I'll tell you what Jane said. Yeah, your mic is still off. She said holy. I can see, I'm a good lip reader on Zoom. So Jane is saying that Kiddushin, Kadosh, Kodesh, Kedusha, Kiddush all mean holiness, Kaddish as well. All right, let's take this one step further. What is holiness in the Jewish tradition? What do we mean when we say something is holy? And you can say that either in an absolute way or you can say it in a comparative way, compared to secular, profane, or ordinary, all three of which are legitimate analogs or antonyms for Kedusha. Mom and Dad, give us a working definition of holiness.
In replication of God, actually.
Okay, beautiful. That is I think, a legitimate claim. And it can be derived from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2, which says, Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy, ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem, for I, the eternal your God, am holy. So logically, one may conclude that holiness contains or is associated with the attribute of acting in Latin, we would say, in imitatio Dei. In Hebrew, we would say, b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. If human holiness is to be understood, it should best be understood as acting in evocation or imitation of the divine. Excellent. What else can we say or can we ascribe to the quality of holiness that would be a legitimate way of understanding the concept in a Jewish context? Other thoughts?
Separate.
Excellent, Peter. Thank you for raising that. I was hoping we would go there because I think that at its root, the quality of Kodesh, Kiddusha, holiness, has to do with separateness or otherness. Probably the most articulate spokesperson for this point of view is the author and theologian Karen Armstrong, who has written numerous works about biblical theology. Though coming from a Christian perspective, she's extraordinarily well-versed in Jewish text and tradition and teaching, in which she makes an excellent case for the quality that we should most closely associate with holiness, this word, Kiddusha in Hebrew, is actually the quality of being separate or other or set aside. Now I'm going to read from the note in the Steinsaltz here on Kiddushin. It goes on to say, a woman is acquired, and that's where we're gonna look at the text in a minute. It is clear from the Gemara, and he references a page down the road, a handful of pages, that although the sages employ identical language both with regard to the acquisition of a woman through betrothal and the acquisitions of property discussed throughout the chapter, there is a qualitative halachic or Jewish legal difference between them. When one, for instance, acquires a Canaanite slave whose legal status is that of property, he assumes ownership of the slave, which includes the right to sell him. The same is true with regard to the acquisition of land, a movable object or chattel, or an animal. It is clear that use of the term acquisition with regard to the betrothal of a woman has nothing to do with ownership. Rather, it relates to the fact that with betrothal, the man renders the woman forbidden to all. All right, this is really important, that the most important quality of something being kodesh or holy or a thing, it can be an object too. It can also be time. Time can be holy. I mean, you think about how kodesh is used. It's deployed in a variety of contexts and assigned to a variety of different nouns functioning as the object, right? So a person can be holy, our behavior can be holy. We know, as my dad pointed out from Leviticus chapter 19, God is holy and we act in imitation of God. We know that the Sabbath is holy, but the rest of the 6 days of the week are not holy. We learn that when you make a gift to the temple, it is also called Kodesh. It is called holy. When you take an animal out of your flock and designate it as a sacrifice at the temple to God, the animal is holy or the offering is holy. The point that Steinsaltz is making here is that the designation of someone or something or some event as holy means that it is restricted for any other purpose or to any other person. Therefore, the essential quality of a Jewish marriage is that the woman and again, this is where traditional Judaism still evinces a gender bias. This is not a two-way street. It's not reciprocal, woman to man, man to woman. The relationship between the husband and the wife is that the wife becomes kodesh to that man, set aside or designated for a holy purpose in a way that she is not and may not be for any other purpose. Right? So it is not actually true. I'm a married man of some vintage now, coming up on a 23rd wedding anniversary. So it is not true if I say I love all people equally. But that's a garbage assertion, right? You can pick that one apart. To be married means you do not love all people equally. You love this one person unequally, and therefore it would not be acceptable in the construct of traditional Jewish marriage. I'm not going to talk about open marriages or any of the other things that modernity has brought us to consider that complicate this vastly. Rather, it is not the case that I would be content or Judaism would deem it acceptable if some other person said, no, 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 I have the same relationship with your wife that you have with your wife. That's the very definition of Kodesh. And therefore, it is really important to understand that the tractate we are going to study that grounds the institution of Jewish marriage is called Kiddushin. Because the term, which means marriage, by the way, I've kind of like buried the lead on that. We know that Kodesh, Kiddushin, Kodesh, Kiddusha, Kadesh, Kiddush all mean holy from Kuf Dalit Shin, the Semitic root here. But it is also the correct term for marriage in the Jewish tradition, because a marital arrangement uh, not just assumes, but imposes, designates that one person is set aside by another for another in a way that no other person is allowed to be. It's exclusive in that way. Okay. So this probably will generate a few comments and questions. Sandy, your hand was up first, so why don't you go first? You just have to unmute, please.
I wanted to say holy is of God, but you're saying something in a different, I think it's really a different way, because you're saying it's set aside.
Mm-hmm. Though, again, godly is not a bad idiomatic translation for holy, at least in the way it is used for certain categories. But what I want to suggest is that the word Kodesh has so many different meanings, which are governed not only by the three-letter root and its original meaning, but which can be gleaned from context, right? So it's probably a stretch to say that a wife is holy in the same way that a sacrificial goat is holy. The similarity is not that they both belong to God, but rather that they are both set aside for an exclusive purpose. The goat that is Kodesh, that is designated as an offering, cannot be slaughtered and eaten for dinner. Its only purpose is sacramental. Similarly, the woman that is set aside for Kiddushin, for Jewish marriage, cannot be appropriated for an unholy purpose by another man. That's the point. That what is denoted here is separateness or setting aside-ness. That quality is what is designated by the word kiddushin or kiddusha.
But isn't
Russell,
it
yeah.
separate because it's separate from everything else because it's part of God, or that's not right?
I think that's a reach. Again, I mean, look, poetically, there are all and midrashically there are all sorts of notions in rabbinic literature that underscore the idea that there is no such thing as a casual relationship between a husband and a wife, right? We don't believe in casual sex in Judaism. It's holy in the sense that it is an act reserved for two people who have set aside each for the other in an exclusive way. Again, this bumps up against modernity and modern norms in America around dating and marriage that are very much at odds, not only with biblical norms, but I would even suggest with rabbinic norms. The idea that, most couples these days are having sex long before they're married and often with many partners, though, still predominantly one at a time, um, would suggest that, well, we're not living in a biblical or rabbinic world. And there's something to be said for the fact that biologically people reach sexual maturation in their teenage years, their adolescence, but society does not want 13 and 14-year-olds getting married, right? So, and nor does Judaism think that being celibate for decades is a great idea. So there are ways in which modernity complicates this scenario. But that's as much as I feel comfortable saying on that subject at this moment. I'm sure we'll come back to this many, many times. These questions will be very much part of our exploration this spring. Russell?
Thank you. This discussion is setting up holiness as a kind of binary operation. Something is either holy or unholy. But my question is, are there gradations of holiness? Exodus and Leviticus introduce us to the concept of the Holy of Holies, which suggests there's some things that are holier than others.
Love
and if
that.
that is the case, does that kind of define holiness out of existence?
Brilliant. I love your insight. And I was thinking, as you said it, yeah, the architecture of the tabernacle, of the Mishkan, the holy place, where God's presence is encountered in the wilderness, is demonstrative of what you're proposing here, which is that, well, there are layers. There are rings or rungs, depending on whether your image is a ladder or of concentric circles, with something can be holier or holiest, depending on where it falls in that sacred architecture. So far as the norms around Jewish marriage are concerned, however, I am not aware of holiness, at least in the traditional literature, being framed as anything other than a kind of binary. Usually, holy is uh, deployed so that you understand it has a clear opposite, which is variously chol, which means ordinary, plain, secular, profane, or even vulgar. Um, and rarely is it designated as holy in comparison to something else that is holy. The only example I can think of from Jewish life that came up recently is because Seder was on a Saturday night this year. Before you go into the main ritual of the Kiddush, you're supposed to make Havdalah. And instead of saying the usual Havdalah blessing on a Saturday night, which is praise to the one who distinguishes between holy and ordinary, bein kodesh lechol, on Seder night this year, we were commanded to say bein kodesh lekodesh, because we were going from one form of holy time, which is the Sabbath, straight into Pesach, which is a different form of holy time. But even then, it's just Kodesh LaKodesh. It's not Kodesh to more or less Kodesh. You've got the holiness of the Sabbath juxtaposed right next to or adjacent to this year, the holiness of the festival. Neither overrides the other, and they exist on kind of an equal footing. So I hear your point, and I think poetically we could probably play with it some more. But again, getting back, it's sort of like well, is a concubine less holy than a wife? Not clear from the text. They're both set aside, but again, some of what I think the rabbis are also doing is they're enshrining a norm of monogamy against the previous established biblical norm of polygamy. So the rabbis do not allow for a man to be married, and I am going to start using that word now, to more than one woman at the same time. And even if you wish to be married to another person in sequence, you have to effectuate a divorce in order to effectuate a second marriage. So the rabbis, I think, are interested in preserving holiness as a kind of self-contained category of exclusivity, as opposed to something that resides on a continuum from more to less. That's my general way through your question. Karen and then Arlene, please.
Thank you. I wonder about the Holy Bible, the Holy Torah. Okay, that is derived from God in some way, or believed to be derived from God, which I guess would make it in one of the tightest circles of holiness, if you want to go there. And yet I wonder to what extent that has to be considered exclusive.
Yeah, by way of answering your question, what I would want to know that I do not know off the top of my head is when the phrase Torat Kodesh or various other constructs that use the word Kodesh or Kedosha are first used in Jewish literature. That would be helpful to me because whereas I can say definitively that Kodesh is a biblical norm, we see it all throughout the Torah, and particularly the book of Leviticus is downright obsessed with the category of holiness. The designation of the Torah, to use your example, as a holy book, I'm not sure that's in the Bible itself. In other words, I'm not sure the Bible conceives of this literature as set aside and sacred the way Kodesh normally means, or if that is a later designation. Clearly, the scribes and the rabbis adopt the notion that the Torah is holy, again, in the sense that it is exclusive. And you can't just write a new chapter or a new book and say, this is now part of the biblical literature. Like that's been decided and done. There are books of Jewish literature that are canon as TaNaKh. They are holy books. And then there are books that are not holy.
So you're thinking of the uniqueness.
Exactly. Yes, unique is an excellent...
Not necessarily exclusive, but unique.
Correct. Uniqueness is another word that captures a lot of what I think the biblical term Kodesh is all about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Arlene.
Okay, I'm wondering whether we're going to see eventually a monogamous relationship set up between a man and a woman in the Torah. Is it going to be? the direction that we're heading, or is
Well,
there
we're
never
not,
going to be?
this course will not be a long-form investigation of Torah. It will be an investigation of the rabbinic norms that are established through the Mishnah and the Talmud.
Okay, so
Having
when,
said that, there are
yeah,
plenty of figures in the Torah who have only one spouse. Again, I'm spitballing here, but my conjecture, my kind of uncorroborated spot conclusion, just drawing on my knowledge of the TaNaKh, is that just because there are examples of monogamous relationships does not mean that there is an enshrined norm of monogamy,
okay,
right? Those would be exceptions or within the range of permissible relationships. They are permissible. And I'm not sure that the Torah ever elucidates a perspective on whether marriage that is monogamous or marriage that is polygamous, that one is better than the other.
okay.
Thank you. Okay, let's do a little reading in our Gemara now. So we're actually starting with Mishnah. So Mishnah 2:1. See, we spent all of that on one word, which is the title of the tractate. Okay, how do we know it's Mishnah? Because the print is big at the beginning. So you open your page of Talmud, the two words at the beginning stare you right in the face. Ha'isha nikneit.
Okay, a woman is
All right, a
acquired.
woman
No.
is acquired. Right. So nikneit literally means purchased, but again, keeping with the notation from the note that I read in the footnote here from Steinsaltz I'm pointing to my printed book to my right. Women are similar to property. And so some of the language, the verbiage, literally the verb language that is deployed here, will resemble how the same tractate and other tractates of the Talmud talk about the acquisition and transfer of property. The key difference, as it says here, is that a woman who is acquired, the key understanding is that what is meant is that the woman is rendered forbidden to anyone else but the person, the man who acquires her. So, ha'isha nikneit bishlosha drachim. Sorry, b'shalosh drachim. So a woman is acquired in one of three ways. All right, that's what it says here. As you can see from the translation, a woman is acquired, that is to say, becomes betrothed to a man to be his wife in three ways. V'kona et atzma, and literally she purchases herself back, or she acquires herself, bishtei drachim, in two ways. So there are three ways for a woman to be acquired by her betrothed, by her bridegroom, and there are two ways for a woman to acquire herself as an independent entity not belonging to the man. Okay, what are the three ways? Nikneit, I'm reading here, b'chesef, so literally with silver or with money. Bishtar, which means a document. A shtar is a writ, W-R-I-T. U, as I said before, and this corroborates my perspective, uvavia, and through sexual congress, through sexual intercourse. All right, now, so the Mishnah provides this opening salvo. This is the very first sentence in Tractate Kiddushin. Reading on. B'kesef. So let's talk about the first of the three ways, meaning with money. According to Beit Shammai Omrim, so according to the Academy of Shammai or the House of Shammai, the teachings that are offered and elucidated in Shammai's name, b'dinar, u'v'shaveh dinar. So how much money, in other words? 1 dinar or the equivalent of a dinar. All right. As you can see from Steinsaltz, with regard to betrothal through money, there is a dispute. Even though the plain text is not in the Hebrew, only the bold text is a literal rendering of the Hebrew. He's interposing what we will learn, which is that, well, there's a debate between Shammai, and of course, if Shammai speaks, Hillel's going to have the counterpoint, and here it is, Uveit Hillel omrim, whereas the house of Hillel says bifruta, with a pruta, which is another form of Mishnaic currency. Uveshaveh pruta, or with the equivalent of a pruta. I did not do my research on dinar versus pruta, but my general understanding is that Hillel has the more liberal policy because a pruta is worth less than a dinar. A pruta is just a very small amount of money, whereas a dinar, it's probably like a buck versus a dime or a buck versus a quarter. Neither one is intended to be onerous, by the way. But of course, knowing that Hillel almost always prevails in these halakhic debates, one can conclude that the more liberal, the more accommodating, financially speaking, stance is the preferred one in Jewish tradition. Goes on to say, "V'chama hi pruta." Well, he goes on to say, well, how much is a pruta anyway? Echad mishmone be'asir ha'italki. He says it is worth 1/8 of the Italian isar. Okay. Again, this is not particularly helpful. I used to collect coins as a kid, but I was mostly into American currency, so I can only come up with what I assume are the equivalents in modern parlance. It is clear that the rabbis want to establish a financial norm, a norm of financial commitment that allows a woman to be claimed as betrothed by the man. Now, again, you might say, boy, this does not seem all that much better than what was going on in biblical times. To which I would submit, that's your 21st century American Jewish perspective speaking. You have to hold that in abeyance and take these texts at face value and recognize that the rabbis are writing from a perspective that is at least 500 years or more after the Torah is more or less codified. So they're dealing with a very old document already. You know, think about a document that we venerate today, such as the collected works of Shakespeare, which are less than 500 years old, if I'm not mistaken. So it is as if this literature has been around for centuries and centuries and is already canonized. So the rabbis are dealing with biblical norms, and so they want to give honor to the place that these texts and these biblical norms have in Jewish life. So we should not expect that all of a sudden they're going to go off in a 21st century feminist direction and give women complete agency. Besides, they're not only innovating, they're also reflecting the norms and customs of their time and place. So I believe that the texts are in dialogue with contemporaneous practice. They aren't just establishing new practice for the future, right? And that's much more of a fluid dynamic, I surmise. So the rabbis are both writing about what is happening and they are codifying what they want to see happen. And when you turn the relationship between a man and a woman from one exclusively rooted in taking, which is the biblical verb that is deployed around this union, and sexual congress alone, the rabbis deem those conditions as perhaps necessary but insufficient for the institution that they are developing here. When I work with wedding couples, I try to elucidate this difference by saying the point of marriage in the rabbinic text, and more to the point, in Judaism, which again, as I said earlier, is rabbinic Judaism, what we practice. The point of marriage is to establish agreed upon communal norms for welcoming a new family to the Jewish community. In order to do that, you need agreed upon social institutions or laws that everyone subscribes to in the society so that one cannot claim a woman in one's name without having gone through this authorized process. And therefore, one cannot be a new family in the community. Very little of, or if any of this, is rooted, as we shall see, in sexual desire or what we would call a romantic attraction between the two. In other words, this does not establish marriage for love. The first and foremost consideration is money, as we have seen in this opening text of the Mishnah, Mishnah Kiddushin 1:1. There are three ways in which a woman is acquired and two in which she acquires herself. In other words, she buys back her own status or buys her own status. We'll talk about that. The idea being that the women who were being betrothed by their fathers, by their parents, to another man for the purpose of establishing a new Jewish family, and presumably are virgins. Right? That's all assumed. That's the ideal circumstance around this. And even a modern day ketubah stipulates different prices that are assigned to the woman depending on her virgin or non-virgin status. So women who are virgins command a higher bride price in the ketubah, which is the writ of marriage, which also outlines and names the financial commitment which the mission is describing here. The virgins command a higher price than, for instance, divorcees and widows. And God help us if a woman is neither a divorcee nor a widow, but has just been defiled by sexual intercourse with someone else. Okay. Mara.
For me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So, but I'm interpreting the passage that you read, not so much as you need to have one of those three things, but it sounds like you need to have all three.
I would agree.
Document. Oh, okay.
Yes. And that's the
And
majority vote on that the tradition will ascribe to this eventually. And a modern day Jewish wedding has an emblem for all three of these. Remember, it says you need three things. You need kesef, so money. You need a shtar, which means a writ, a document. And you need bia, you need sexual intercourse. At a Jewish wedding, you must have three emblems that stand in for these three provisions. One, money. That's the ring. The ring actually has to be valued at a pruta. Right? So, but technically you could just exchange, the Talmud will make clear, you could just exchange any item of value of a pruta or more. So you could technically, I guess, hand your bride a Black & Decker toaster oven, assuming it's more than a pruta in value, and that would constitute a legitimate transaction, at least on the terms that are stipulated here. Traditionally, it's a ring. We'll talk about why, I'm sure, down the road, but traditionally it's a ring. A shtar, that's the ketubah itself, the writ, right? You cannot be married in the Jewish tradition without a ketubah. And I insist on it even as a Reform rabbi who has a basically non-halachic approach to Jewish life, not anti-halachic. It's just that my colloquial take on halacha as a Reform Jew and as a Reform rabbi is halacha gets a vote, not a veto. Like, it doesn't govern everything we do about Jewish life, but it has a very significant voice in what we do in Jewish life. So you have to have a writ, a ketubah, document, and sexual intercourse. Now, fortunately, we don't like wait until that deed is done, and it's kind of pointless these days because I just operate under the assumption that most of the couples I'm marrying have already engaged in sexual intercourse. The chuppah itself is the stand-in. The chuppah is, as it were, a birth chamber for a new Jewish family. It is the sign of the home. And if you look at the choreography of a Jewish wedding, right, if you have living parents, your parents escort you to the chuppah and may even stand under the chuppah with you, but they release the couple to exit together. A new Jewish family has been formed under that chuppah through the signing of a document, the exchange of an item of value, and being in the chuppah itself, the birth chamber of a new family, or the tent of family and home. So obviously, the way we create a family means a lot of different things today, but I think the idea that the symbol for creating a new family is a chuppah, is a tent. We learned already, what happens in the tent. Remember the story of Jacob and Leah. They go into the tent. That's how you know they're married, right? So it's a euphemism for what happens in the chamber, in the bedroom. Okay. We have a few more minutes to proceed. So going back just to the text for a moment. So we hear the Beit Hillel perspective, which says we should make marriage as attainable as possible, and one should not be excluded from the privilege, or to use a Christian word, marriage is a sacrament. Um, how do I, why do I feel comfortable saying that, even though I know there are Christological overtones that can't be unheard when you hear the language of sacrament? Sacrament literally means a holy thing. And the word for marriage is Kiddushin. So marriage is quite literally a holy thing. You are setting aside this one person. And again, it's not reciprocal in traditional Judaism, even in Orthodoxy today. I'm doing a wedding in a month on May 22nd, I think at Mamaroneck Beach and Yacht Club, and I'm co-officiating with the groom's rabbi. The bride grew up at WRT. So the groom affiliates Orthodox. The bride grew up at WRT, thinks of herself as Reform. And they're kind of like figuring out what this means. The groom is not particularly devout, but when he goes to shul to daven, he goes to an Orthodox shul. So he's asked his rabbi, who's very sweet. I really like him. He's like 12 years old. Now I can say that. I think he's 31. He was recently ordained. He's a newlywed himself. Lovely fellow named Shua. So Rabbi Shua Mermelstein and I have been talking online about how to do this wedding. And one of Shua's red lines, one of Rabbi Mermelstein's red lines as an Orthodox rabbi, is that he will not allow the bride to present a ring to the groom under the chuppah. Because in the chuppah, where the confines of halacha, of Jewish law, hold sway, in his understanding as an Orthodox rabbi, an Orthodox Jew, you've got to stick to the letter of the Jewish law. And Jewish law provides explicitly that it is the responsibility of the groom, of the husband, to betroth the wife through the exchange of an item of value. So the groom puts ring on finger of bride, which she accepts. He says the traditional line, "Thou art consecrated unto me with this ring according to the law of Moses and Israel." That's the rabbinic line. We're going to get to this in weeks to come, how this ritual really evolves and develops. But that's the thing. She does not put a ring on his finger, but because they are a modern couple, each of whom wants to wear a wedding band. I, as a Jewish man, do not have to wear a wedding band, but I choose to, which is a statement about how Kelly and I view our marriage in egalitarian terms. She will give him the ring at the ketubah signing beforehand. So he's actually going to walk under the chuppah already with a ring on his finger. In other words, it satisfies this rabbi's requirements of the chuppah ceremony being traditional. It satisfies the couple's interest in being egalitarian and modern, right? Okay, but you need to know that if you go to an Orthodox wedding, pay close attention. The bride will not put a ring on the finger of the groom, whereas the groom will put a ring on the finger of the bride because it is his bride to acquire. And I'm using the language that the Mishnah uses here. It is an act of acquisition, but it is not the same as owning any other kind of property. It is more the point that this acquisition means that you are mine, you belong to me the way no other woman belongs to, the way you belong to no one else. I love you differently than I love all other people, and vice versa. And that's why, again, Kedusha, Kodesh as exclusivity, unique, privileged, set aside, set apart. And therefore, by the way, I would invert what my dad proposed earlier, which is that to be holy means to act in imitation of God. In a way, the qualities we assign to God are actually an imitation of the human notion of holiness, right? What we say about God in Judaism is Adonai Echad. Not that God is one so much, but that God is unique. God is not like, there is no Mi chamolcha ba'ilim Adonai, who is like you, O God? Ein kamolcha. None is like you. You are echad, you are unique. So we are assigning the quality of Kedusha to God in imitation or evocation of what we understand holiness to mean in the realm of human affairs. Does that make sense? Okay. Mom and Dad, question.
Of course, this exclusivity only goes in one direction.
Correct.
I mean, because the husband is not exclusive to the wife. he can, she has taken him aside from all others, and she is exclusively his. He
We're
is
going to
not
get into this in
exclusively
weeks to
hers.
come. Correct. And it leads to some real problems, as we modern Jews understand it, even in the Orthodox world, around what happens to how do we deal with adultery? Adultery, as defined by this, would logically suggest that only a woman can be an adulteress, that a man cannot be an adulterer, technically speaking. That gets reinforced differently under the rabbinic law, but it's a logical conjecture. And it also means that women can have more difficulty securing a divorce than men can have in providing a divorce. So that is also non-reciprocal. The issuance of a get, a writ of divorce, as we'll get to several weeks from now, is not a bidirectional phenomenon. It must be issued by the husband to the wife. Now, a rabbinical court, a Beit Din, can compel the husband to divorce the wife, but there are still very, very tragic and horrifying examples from modern day ultra-Orthodox Jewish life where women end up chained to their husbands because no Beit Din, no rabbinical court, will grant a get, will compel the husband to give a get. Those women are called agunot, which literally means chained. They are chained to their husband. It's a huge social justice concern for and about the Jewish community, even today. Like there are women who are imprisoned in marriages against their will today, who have not successfully been able to break free from their husbands. It shouldn't work that way. That's not supposed to be how it happens, but there's a corrupt collusion between some ultra-Orthodox rabbis and the men in their community who don't want to divorce their wives, even when the wife wants a divorce. And so the rabbis collude with these men, often who are abusive, to perpetuate the condition of abuse. We'll get to all of this. I want to make it clear this is a very small fraction of what happens in traditional Jewish communities around marriage, but it is a real problem. The conservative and reform movements have their own way of dealing with it, which is basically either to modify the traditional language of the ketubah or to be completely abstract in the language of the ketubah. But in Orthodoxy, it's a real problem. Okay. And on that, we'll conclude for today. That's quite an intriguing cliffhanger, but much more to learn. We only did one Mishnah, but we did a lot of study today. And I'm so grateful to be back with you in this sacred encounter. So as a way of reinforcing at least one point that we learned today, albeit in a tangential way, we do not say Chag Sameach today or tomorrow. Say it on the 7th and 8th day of Pesach. If you're one of those people who enjoys observing 8 days of Pesach, I call you a masochist. If you insist on being a diaspora Jew who only cares about this diaspora custom, sei gesund, enjoy, I will be breaking Pesach on Saturday night. This means that Saturday is a Chag, but today is not a Chag. Today is just Chol. It's called Chol HaMoed, literally the ordinary intermediary days of the festival. Saturday, the 7th day of Pesach, and again, if you're a masochist, the 8th day as well, Sunday, are Kodesh. On days that are Kodesh, you can say Chag Sameach because it is Chag. It is holy time. Today, you do not say Chag Sameach, but it's still Pesach. We're still observing the restrictions around matzot. And we're counting the Omer. We're doing a few other Pesach things, right? So the greeting for the Chol HaMoed, for the intermediary non-Kodesh days of the festival, is Moadim L'Simcha, which literally means these are times for joy. And you say, Hagim Luzmanim L'Sason, which means, yes, festivals and seasons of rejoicing. So I wish you Moadim L'Simcha, and together, Hagim Luzmanim L'Sason. Have a fantastic rest of your Pesach festival. I'll be on the Bima tomorrow night. I will not be at services on Saturday morning, but we do have a 10 a.m. Pesach final day of the festival and Yizkor service where memorial prayers and reflections will be offered by Rabbi Plakow and Cantor Kleinman. So, Moadim L'Simcha, Shabbat Shalom, and an early Chag Sameach for Saturday. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Rabbi, why is there no Torah study?
Because the festival falls on a Saturday.
Because it's a festival.
Yep, it's a festival day. It's Chag. Take care.
Thank you.